You have Hannah, barren woman. These people have no prospects, no strength whatsoever, but they are displayed in the book as being humble. And God exalts them. Why? Because God breaks the bow of the mighty. But those who are feeble, the weak, they're bound by strength, just not their own strength. Don't mistake the fact that you can't see something or understand something as God's abandoned you. It's not true. We are going to start a new book today, 1 Samuel. I'm actually really excited about this, one of my favorite books for multiple reasons, but I had to think this week how the heck we're going to tackle it to start, right? It's always about this trajectory to get you started. How do we do that, and how do we do it well that it's not overwhelming, because you know I can be a little lengthy, and so how do we not stay here 2 hours, right? That's the I would love it. I'm guessing some of you, probably even my own wife, would be like, nah, let's be done with this. So here's the thing I'm going to do. I want to today give us just an overview of Samuel, not in the actual individual verses. We're going to tackle that next week. Now, the reason I wanted to do this because I didn't want to tack on an intro to actual verses that we're going to unpack. I think that it would do disservice to one or the other, right? But you can't know about Samuel until you know why Samuel's in the Bible and why it is where it is in the Bible, because that matters. If I could do you the best service of your life, I promise you it would be this. If I could get you only to just stop thinking of the Bible. I don't know if this is true of anybody in here. When somebody, let me say it this way, when somebody helped me to realize that the Bible is not a bunch of individual books that stand alone. The Bible is one story. If you can get that alone, it will change the entire discussion in your mind as to how you read any Bible verse, especially a book like Samuel. Because the idea would be if my wife wrote me a letter and it was 10 pages long and I just only read page 5, that's nonsensical. That doesn't make sense, but that's how we treat the Bible. We treat the Bible like they're these individual compartmentalized pieces of material and that we can do with them anything we want to do with them, and that's not true. It's not true. And so what we want to be able to do is say, not only what is the book of Samuel, where is the book of Samuel, and why is it there, and what is it trying, what cog in the machine of this story that God is telling is it playing? What role is it serving? That's what we're here to do today. Get an intro to the entire book and why it is where it is in the Bible. That's our roadmap, okay? Now, I don't know how you process information. I'm a rabid note taker. And I'm the kind of note taker that I get annoyed very, very easily because I want to capture every word. I want to kind of be like a court stenographer, which never happens because I got these giant hands that don't write fast. And so I went ahead and gave you this paper because this is basically what I'm about to cover. So if you are a note taker and that's how you process, fine. Scribble and do whatever you do, right? If you are not, and what I would hope you would do is listen to the story. Because really what I want to do is tell you a story. I want to tell you the story of the entire Bible up to 1 Samuel. Okay? I think we can do it. I think we can tackle it quickly and treat it, I think, like the original hearers would have understood it, and that is as a story. What I want to do is walk us through God's entire story up to Samuel. Can we do that? I think so. So let me start. We haven't done this in a while. If you've been here for a little bit, you'll understand this. But I created this pyramid a while ago because God's story, the entire Bible, is summed up right here. Now, God is a God of stories, and He's telling one continuous story that is still happening in this day. Right now, you are living in God's story. Right now, we're 20 centuries after the cross, and we're in the New Covenant era, and God chose to write His stories through covenants, 6 of them. Right? We have them all listed here, which we're not going to be able to go through all of them. But we have the original covenant with Adam and Eve. We have the covenant with Noah. We have the covenant with Abraham. We have the covenant with Moses, David, and then the new covenant in Christ. That's God's story right here. We are somewhere right over there. God's telling one story. Okay? Do you understand what I'm saying? What we need to know is, where does Samuel fit in here? And this is what I think the power of this of this tool, this teaching tool that kind of shaped, when I first went to Bible college and into seminary, this kind of helped shape me. Nobody ever did the pyramid like this, but they did the covenants talk. And when I first heard about covenants as the backbone of the Bible, as the kind of just the backbone that kept the entire story together, it changed the entire way I viewed the Bible completely. So now, any book that I go to, fathers especially in the room, you train your family in the Bible, any book you go to, you say what? Where's it at? Where's it at in God's storyline? Because if you know that, that's going to tell you something. That's going to tell you, where are we in God's one story? Are we past Jesus? Are we before Jesus? That's going to be a different discussion, right? These kinds of things really matter. If you don't know all of this, who cares? What I want you to at least be maybe opened up to is that this is a structure of the entire Bible. This would represent all of human history right here, okay? Now, I just want to walk us through briefly. I wrote an entire book on this, right? But I just want to walk us through briefly about each of these little progressions of the story. Can we do that, okay? So, we're going to start in creation. One of the things that I always want to hold on to is what happened in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. If you're going to understand Samuel, you got to understand Genesis, or you're not going to understand why Samuel is the way that it is. And if you don't know Genesis, you're going to just make up your own reasons as to why Samuel is what it is. And we can't do that. We got to really guard against that. What happens in Genesis? God creates, and he creates a perfect creation. He also creates image bearers, people uniquely, at the end of his creation, uniquely made in his image. They're not like animals. They are image bearers. Animals do not bear his image. They are his creation. We have image bearers now, and what are their roles? Their functional roles in the Garden of Eden were to be, Adam was called to be a priest king. Think about what those two things signify. He's called in the garden to be a king. He's expressing dominion. He reigns over this area. And he's also a priest. What does a priest do? A priest acts as a go-between, what we would call a mediator between God and the rest of God's stuff. Notice that when God created, what did he do? He created order out of chaos, right? The world, this is so cool to preach. I've never preached like this before. When the windows shake, that's cool. God has created order out of chaos, right? The waters were just chaotic in the first part. God brings order, but he doesn't bring total order. God doesn't name the animals. He has Adam continue what he started. Why? Because he's made in his image. So Adam gets the privilege as a priest king to, in one sense, do what God did. He gets to bring more order. He starts to name animals. He expresses dominion over God's garden. He does all of these things. And then what happens? So listen, by Genesis 1 and 2, we're going great. The world is incredible. Because of their perfection, they get to have face-to-face contact with God. God created image bearers, think about this, to uniquely live with him. The problem is today, you're not living with God. Neither am I. And we act like this was the norm, but this is not the norm. This was the norm. Something happened that changed the norm. And what was that? A mutiny. A mutiny took place in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve wanted to take God's throne for themselves. It came in the form of this idea of the knowledge of good and evil. That God said, don't touch that tree. Eve, through the whole thing that we don't have time to go through, she basically does it. Adam does not express dominion over the serpent, does not express dominion even over his wife in controlling the scenario. And what happens? We broke the world. A mutiny to remove God off of his throne because I want to be the one to tell me what's right and wrong in my own life. God said that's the knowledge of good and evil. Stay away from it. God gets to be the decider. And what is every sin now that you're involved with to this day? It's you trying to be God. Name a sin. I'll tell you how. It is you trying to be God. If I lie, it's because I want to decide what's truth for me. I don't care. I know that God tells me not to lie, but I don't care. Why? Because I want to be God. I'll decide what's right for me. This is what we struggle with. It is all back to the Garden of Eden. Every sin you've ever committed is a replica in one sense, of the Garden of Eden. That's all you're doing. You're replaying the mutiny. That's all you're doing, right? This is what broke the world, what we call the fall. That's how we sanitize it a little bit. We say, oh, it's just the fall. No, it was a mutiny where we tried to take God, remove him from his throne, and to take it for ourselves. It should have enacted immediate execution. There is no reason that you or me, that we should be able to sin ever. The moment I commit one sin against God, I should be summarily executed instantly, because that would be justice. God chose instead to enact a plan of redemption. He showed mercy and grace. The whole story, now think of this as if this were a novel, which in one sense, this is a novel, right? But it's a true historical story. The whole idea is that God is going to live with people again. He's not right now, but he enacts this entire storyline to fix what happened at the Garden of Eden. Human beings are supposed to, we're created to live with God, and we were separated from God, and now God launches this entire redemptive story to fix that problem. He will live with human beings again. He will have a people for himself. And so, God, because he's an incredible storyteller, launches into this very intricate and highly detailed story. By the way, God could have sent Jesus right in the Garden of Eden. Have you ever thought about this? Fall happens, right? Serpent, Jesus goes and dies right then. Done. Or he could have executed Adam and Eve, done on the spot, and we're back to square one. God didn't do it that way. He's not bound to do it anyway, but he chose to do it this way. So what does he do? He then starts a plan of redemption. He separates them from the Garden of Eden, and I want you to see, this is so crucial. In the Garden of Eden, that is land-oriented. What does that mean? That means that God lives in a certain place. It's the garden of a location, Eden. He removes them from Eden. He, in one sense, you might say, exiles them. He's removed from their presence. The rest of this story, by the way, you don't think that land is a critical part of this whole story? It's essential. Why? Because God's going to live with you again. And so he systematically starts to do that very thing. He kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. The problem is, once sin is in the world, does it stay small? No, it's a cancer, and that cancer metastasizes everywhere. Think about it. The first sin is them choosing to do this fruit. The second recorded sin is murder. Murder. We jumped high. We went way, and then by the time we get into Noah, everyone's doing evil all the time. That's all. In fact, that's how the scriptures say it. It's everything in their heart at all times is evil only. God does an entire reset button where he shows how much wrath he has for wickedness, and he wipes the earth clean with a flood. But graciously again, he doesn't do that to every single human being. He holds on to a remnant, right? Noah and his family. You're going to go in this boat, and you are going to be here, and you're going to now act like, in one sense, a new Adam, right? The earth is being wiped clean, and then you're going to exit the ark, and God's going to reestablish a covenant with you, and you're going to now repopulate the earth. In one sense, they're like a new Adam and a new Eve, but there's still sin in the world. As we continue forward, what happens? We have, after that right away, which is not listed in here, but before we get to Abraham, there's one critical event that happens before Abraham. Anybody know? Trivia moment? Anybody know? What happens after Noah, but before Abraham? That's essential to the story. Say loud and proud. Tower of Babel. Why would that matter? Right? Just chapter 10. Why do we care about the Tower of Babel? Because the Tower of Babel is where God does what? He creates nations. Well said. Say it again. Like it. So because of sin, and it was through real sin, no question about that, God separates them by language, right? Which is a way of creating nations, and then they have to what? Segregate according to being able to understand each other. So what does God do? He creates nations in Genesis. Why would he do that? Because he's about to call a nation. He's about to call one nation, Abraham, to be his people. Before this, he's just been dealing with individuals. Now he's going to call an entire people group to himself. in the land of Israel, in the nation of Israel, which will go into the land in a minute. Part of Abraham's covenant is that I will make you a people and you will be given a land. Why does that matter to the story? Because land is essential. Why is land essential? Because God will live amongst his people once again. He is starting to systematically get closer and inch his way to live with his people again. The problem is, there's sin. You can't have unfettered access anymore to God because you have sin, and God's righteousness and his holiness would consume you. So he has to then, through barriers, have relationship with his people. He calls Abraham, and he says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and you will reach, the rest of the world will be blessed through you. It's Genesis 12, right? Is that true? Did that happen? You are sitting here today because of the Abrahamic covenant. You believe in this man, this Son of God named Jesus, because of Abraham, the covenant that God made with Abraham. He, through Abraham, reached the nations, which is all of us. All of us right here. 10,000 miles away from where all this happened in the Middle East? In this case, 4,000 years later, here we are. God has reached the nations. He continues. The Abrahamic covenant is, I'm going to make you a great nation, right? Whoever blesses you, I'll bless. Curses you, I'll curse, etc. And then what happens? Through the patriarchs and Joseph, a critical discussion point in the storyline, what happens to Joseph? His brothers, through sinful means, take him and they throw him into a pit and they put him into exile, right? Through slavery, they take him out of the land into a foreign land. And what happens? God, in one sense, you could say it seems like God has abandoned this guy, gets sold into slavery into Egypt, but this was God's plan all along. Why? Because to Abraham, God made a specific prediction, a prophecy, Genesis 15, where he said, I'm going to give you this land, but before I give you this land, what's going to happen? 400 years of slavery. You're going to get this land through slavery, right? There's going to be, in other words, tribulation first, then land. So God sends Joseph. Joseph, through sinful means, gets taken out of the land into Egypt, where he, through this whole storyline, which I wish, my favorite character in the Bible, I wish we could have time to just talk all through that. Joseph comes in. He is then, through miraculous means, he is brought into power in Egypt as the second in command. Now that is an incredible blessing. Through the storyline, Joseph goes and gets his father, all of his whole family. I think they said 70 off the top of my head. 70 people are brought in to Egypt, and through the famine, and Canaan, or the people of God, are saved. But what happens? We know this in the book of Exodus, that it says the Pharaoh who knew Joseph died. And then there's a new Pharaoh. And he didn't like how much God's people were multiplying. Why? Because God's people were living out the command to be fruitful and multiply, and they were becoming thick in the land, and Egypt got scared. And so they enslaved them, just like God predicted, Genesis 15. This is the story. Now it looks like if you were watching this as a movie, like the ominous music is playing right now, you're like, how are God's people ever going to thrive? Abrahamic covenant is in total danger right now because this is not a nation. These are slaves. But God is very dramatic. You ever experienced God being dramatic in your life? I've always told my family, if you ever think that I see what God's doing here, I would say you're about 99% sure you got it wrong. If you would ever say such things or feel that way, you probably got it wrong, because God will not be figured out. He makes that a point, seems like. No difference here in his story. They're now in Egypt, and what happens in Egypt? They need a deliverer because they're enslaved. Now, why would God take them into Egypt, put them into slavery, just to free them? Why go through 4 centuries of that nonsense? Why not just bypass that and deliver them to their land? Fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. God is going to give us a historical example of a spiritual reality inside of us. And what is that? We're all slaves. You're all slaves. You all need a deliverer. You all need to be rescued and brought into a land full of milk and honey. You all need to be sent a deliverer, a Messiah, right? By the way, Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew, all this means is anointed one. Someone set aside for God's purposes. We always think of Messiah as Jesus, but I would always differentiate that by a capital M. There's a capital M Messiah, only one of those in the entire world. And then there are lowercase m Messiahs. God has sent many deliverers before Jesus. They were all shadows of the real deliverer, though. God sends a Messiah. Who's that? Moses. Moses is sent to go and get God's people because he heard their cry. He goes and gets the people, and he takes them out through that miraculous set of circumstances in the plagues and all that. He takes them out, and he delivers them. But where does he take them to? Right away to the promised land? No, they go right to Mount Sinai. Why? Right? If this is one story, why do they go to Sinai? Because this people has a calling on their lives. What is that calling? To be a light to the nations. Abrahamic covenant is that the nations of the world will be blessed through you guys, the Jews. And if you're going to be a blessing, if you're going to actually be the people of God, you have to be able to give the nations God's standard. So he takes them to Mount Sinai and he gives them his law. This is my standard. We call it the Ten Commandments, other laws after that as well. And he calls them there in a covenantal world to be a holy priesthood. What does a priesthood do? Anybody, talk to me for just 1 second. What does a priesthood do? If I said you're a priest, what does that do? I know we have probably a lot of cultural baggage with that term, but what, in the general sense, what does a priest do? Okay, mediates, 100%. Anybody else? Anything else? Say again? Yeah, okay, which might be a form of mediation for sure. Okay, excellent. They teach. Okay, they act in your stead. So what does a priest do in Old Testament law and Old Covenant? You can't walk up to God because we're not in the Garden of Eden anymore. Before, you're in the Garden of Eden, you go right up to God. No issues. There's no barriers at all. Now, because of our mutiny, there is barriers. God sends representatives to now act in your stead and represent you before the king. All of that pointing to, obviously, our great high priest, Jesus. But until that day, we have a bunch of smaller priests, you might say. And that's what he called the entire nation of Israel to be, a priesthood. In other words, you are to go take God's law to the nations and represent the nations to God. You're going to be the one in the Old Covenant reality, which is what we are going to know is going to be the temple complex and all that's coming. My point is, God shows his wrath of wickedness. God's going to call a nation. That nation's going to be a holy priesthood. And then Moses delivers them after Sinai. And where does he take them? They go right to the desert because they're not allowed to enter the land. Why? Because the people of God are wicked. They are wicked. By the way, just like us, we're wicked. If you don't think you're wicked, I'll just say you're wicked. Okay? You are wicked. So am I. And so we need, so through that whole wandering experience, even Moses, the irony, maybe the unforeseen detail of the story is that Moses doesn't get to enter the land. I mean, if we read that now and it's no big deal. It's like, oh yeah, Moses didn't get to go. But could you imagine, like, this is the guy. This is the Messiah. This is the deliverer. This is the guy that everyone looked up to. God said that he always spoke to Moses face to face, like nobody else on the planet. Moses does one thing that bars him from the Garden of Eden, from the land of Canaan. He's not allowed to take the people into the land. And now, someone else steps up. Who's that? Joshua. Now, if we're in the storyline, this is kind of where we're at, right? We just got the law. We're not to David yet. I want you to see how this story plays into itself. It's one continuous narrative that one book after the other is building upon. And it's centered around land, it's centered around covenants. Now, after Moses dies, what happens? We have Joshua. This is what I mean when I say, if you understand this pyramid, this covenantal structure of the Bible, you want to read the book of Joshua? Find out where it is. You want to read the book of Haggai or Zephaniah? Find out where it is. And then we plug it in and we understand where we at in the story. Okay, let's track there, and then let's read our text, right? This is at least a starting point. Joshua, what does Joshua come in here and do? Well, Joshua is going to help fulfill the land promise that God made to Abraham. God said, you're going to be a nation. What does a nation need? Borders and land and people. That's what Joshua's here to do. He's going to actually conquer the land that God promised to give to them. Now, under Joshua's leadership, they enter the promised land, not by their own strength, but by God's sovereign power. And what do they start to do? They start to conquer. And they start to get they conquer all these sections, and then they start to hand out allotments for the land for the 12 tribes. They start to do that. Now they're in the land. There's so much detail that we're having to skip over. These are just if you had to tell someone the entire story of the Bible in 20 minutes, this is how you would do it. This is how I would do it. Joshua does that. Then we go into the book of Judges. What happens after the book of Judges? They're in the land. What do we find? People are wicked. The people are wicked. What Israel seems to love to do in the Old Testament is they like to one-up the pagan nations. In other words, let's say the pagan nations are this evil. Israel likes to show them how to be more evil. And so the Judges, the book of Judges, famously is this book of cycles that theologians call it the cycles of sin, right? Where the nation falls into sin, right? Gets into these kind of follows after the nations around them, and they get taken they get kind of oppressed by a foreign power, and then God sends them some sort of deliverer, what they call a judge, to then free them from that particular power, and then they start the cycle all over again. They get freed. Let's say they're enslaved for, let's say, maybe 40 years, and then they get freed, and then they have a measure of peace, and then they go back to being pagans again. And then God sends another foreign army, and the whole time in the book of Judges, it's that cycle of repeating. By the way, you do that in your life? We act like sometimes, these morons. Like, how can you still do that? What's wrong with you? Oh, wait, but I got to wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, and guess who does that? Every day. Someone who's living in the new covenant era and has more detail of God's story than anybody before me. Me. We're just like the ancient Israelites. No different. We're no different. Here they are. The problem with the book of Judges is that sin never stays the same, by the way, and by that I mean sin always grows. We've already seen this in God's story. You think that, by the way, you're going to commit one sin? Let's say you have a particular area that you struggle in. You think that sin is going to stay the same? No. Sin's always going to grow in your life. Sin will take you further than you could ever dream that you would ever go, into more compromise than you would have ever bet. You would have bet your house that you would never compromise the way that you do. Sin does this all the time. Sin grows. This is what happens in Judges. They don't just start with, they start in this area, and then they kind of come back, and then they kind of have these like moments of, wow, so sorry. But the problem is, it degrades. Even as they come back to God, they come back not wholeheartedly. And then it just gets worse and worse and worse. Now, the end of the book of Judges, the problem that we see in Judges is that the people have no king. And when there's no king in the land of Israel, the priesthood is corrupted, and the people wander away from God. Now, people go wrong here. I want to say one thing. People typically have a problem when you start talking about the idea that Israel was supposed to always have a king. Let's keep going. They go, no, the problem is that they were supposed to have God as their king, and that the issue came about that, they just wanted to be like the rest of the world. Well, that's not necessarily true. Back here with Moses, Deuteronomy 17, he gave all the stipulations of the requirements of a king when they entered into the land. They were always supposed to have a king. The difference is, they wanted a king like the rest of the nations. They wanted to be like them, a king of their choosing. And God said, I'm the one to choose your king for you. When there's no king in the land of Israel, the priesthood again is corrupt and people wander from God. The book of Judges ends with these words. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Last verse in the book of Judges. Okay? Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Sounds a lot like Noah's day. If you're holding on to the entire story, we're back to the flood days in terms of corruption. Nothing has changed. Centuries have gone by, nothing's changed. Okay. And now, after the book of Judges, what's the next book? Say it with me. Samuel. Just kidding. It's not Ruth. So, Ruth is the next book in the Bible, but today we're going to deal with Samuel. Why would I skip? And I'll tell you why. If you're following the progression, right, you have, again, you have Deuteronomy here at the last book of the law, and then you go into Joshua, Judges, and then there's a Ruth book right before you hit the Samuels, right? Ruth, the reason why we're not going to really spend a whole lot of time on that today is because it's an essential book. It's a critical book, but the difference is that this is about a kind of a Moabitess outsider, a non-Israelite who gets brought in, an amazing story, by the way. You can read it in one sitting. It's a small book. Gets brought into the people of God, kind of grafted in. Kind of a cool story about how the Abrahamic covenant is going to work. The Abrahamic covenant is going to go for the nations. And so we have one example, Ruth, who's not an Israelite, but gets brought in. She says those famous lines like, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, right? And so... which I think is always funny that they say that in weddings all the time, right? Which I'm like, do you realize you're playing the Ruth character, right? You realize that? So you're the pagan and you're going to come? Okay, so it's not a good fit, but I get why they say it. So the idea being, Ruth comes in and we have Gentile inclusion. That is critical to the storyline that God is telling. Why? Because he's undoing the Garden of Eden. Everything goes back to Genesis 3. Everything. The whole rest of the Bible is all about how to fix Genesis 3. The entire book. And it's one story. Do yourself a favor, please. I plead with you. Don't think of these books as compartmentalized stories that can be just taken on their own. It's one story. One continuous story. Now we come to the book of Samuel. Okay. In the story that God is telling, why is this book so essential? I want to tell you this, by the way. There are not two books of Samuel. There was one scroll of Samuel. We call 1st and 2nd now, but that's a technology issue, right? They can't make those scrolls that large, so they split it. That's one story. There's like kind of the ancient Jewish kind of Judaism would never call it 1st and 2nd Samuel. They call it Samuel, right? So it's viewed as one book. That's just a bit of worthless trivia so that you can have. But one book, the author. Let's go into just some of the details here. Who wrote the book of Samuel? Now, I want to tell you a couple things, and I don't want you to get freaked out. I don't think you will, but it's jarring at first when I first heard this, and that is, we do not know. Very few books in the Bible ever have authors spelled out inside of the books. Most of the books are written anonymously. Paul would be an example of somebody who wrote and told us who was writing. Book of Samuel never says authored by X. So, how do we know who wrote it? Well, Jewish tradition helps us in this area. Where they think that Samuel wrote it. He wrote at least parts of it. Because Samuel, if you remember the story, dies during King Saul's reign. So Samuel's not alive. So at least they think he wrote the portions about his life. And he probably also wrote the book of Judges. And then a prophet, Nathan and Gad, probably finished the other portions of Samuel when Samuel was dead. Now, some people look at these kinds of details and go, like it's a gotcha. Oh, so we can't have any trust in the Bible or its authority or its inerrancy because we don't even know who the authors are. It's not true. It's not true. Listen, God, through his Holy Spirit, empowers people all the time. He called many prophets. Some were writing prophets, some were not writing prophets. Elijah, again, would be an example of a non-writing prophet. He never wrote a book called Elijah, but he called prophets all the time, and the Holy Spirit used these prophets all the time, spoke through them. And so the idea of having authors that the Holy Spirit would uniquely speak through to keep his revelation is no problem at all. And so I wouldn't be freaked about that at all. Some write and some don't. Now, what are the dates? Just so we have a general time period, right? So this is about the time of the judges into, that's right about King Solomon. Okay, so that's the historical time period that the two Samuels are going to deal with, right? And I'm just going to call it the book of Samuel. That 1st and 2nd Samuel that they deal with is about that time period right there. And I want to get to this main part down here, which is, what's the purpose? Now, this is the crucial discussion. This is the crucial part of our storyline. Transition to the monarchy. Why does this matter? What were they before they were a monarchy, before there was a king? They had judges, right? God sent them unique prophets. God sent them people. They were just 12 tribes, right? Kind of the city-states of their own little clans that they would just all, sometimes they wouldn't work together, sometimes they would. What the kingdom does is it brings them together under one authoritative banner with one head. Do you see salvation history in this? By the way, it's prophesied that King Jesus is going to be an actual king. And you need to have a monarchy if he's going to be through the line of royalty. And this is what we're transitioning to now. And Samuel is brought in to do this big thing in the nation of Israel. This is a monumental transition in the life of this nation. They're no longer going to be scattered, right? But they're being brought now under a head. And they're being brought into, as the people of God, into their land. And then we're going to establish, which we're not going to be able to deal with now because that's a Solomon discussion, but the temple is essential. And I want you to think about the temple and why it matters so much. Because we're getting one step closer to the Garden of Eden. Do you see it? You were separated at the Garden of Eden. You cannot have communion with God. We're getting closer and closer and closer. Think about what's happening in the new covenant right now. Do you have communion with God if you're a follower of Jesus Christ? Yes, God actually lives inside of you. You're closer to the Garden of Eden than you've ever been, ever. One day, the true Garden of Eden will be fully realized, what we call glorification. The entire story of what we call history is God undoing the Garden of Eden and bringing us from what started with, the heavens and the earth are going to come into a new heavens and a new earth. This is the whole trajectory of where we're headed. You live right now, 20 centuries in the new covenant, waiting for glorification so that we can see God again face to face. Our sins have already been dealt with. Our mutiny has been removed from us. We are now brought back. The Holy Spirit has even been given to us as a deposit, as a down payment for that day. We can be sure that day is coming because the Holy Spirit lives inside of us. Do you realize the privileged time that you live in? Do you realize this? Samuel is bringing us into the monarchy, and this is a crucial discussion point. You live under King Jesus, and it started here. Samuel was chosen to do that. Cool story, and we're going to go through it line by line, but not today. Now, a couple of things that I want you to see and just kind of keep in your mind when we think about the book of Samuel as a whole, okay? 1 Samuel 2:4 is our passage that is a thesis verse. I had Aaron read it because it's a thesis verse. We did this in Mark, if you remember. What's the thesis in Mark? That Jesus isn't just the Christ, he's the Son of the living God. That's the thesis, and then he spends 16 chapters proving that statement to you. This is our thesis here. One of them. I mean, there's multiple interpretations of thesis, but we're going to hold on to this thesis here. 1 Samuel 2:4, and here's what it says. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. What does that mean? Okay, here's what we think. How this is going to play itself out throughout all of the book is there's going to be people characters, we'll say, but these are historic. When I say character, I don't mean fiction. I mean true historical figures, but we'll call them characters. There's going to be characters in this book that are strong in their own eyes. They are mighty in the ways of the world. Right? Now, those people, listen, they're proud of themselves. They're proud about what they can do, what they can accomplish, their capacities. They're going to be people. Maybe some of you have heard, and maybe you've heard of some of these characters. Maybe you don't know all of them. One of them is named Peninnah, which is in the first chapter. She's able to have children. And she's like, look at me. By the way, that was a powerful reality. We don't think about this in our culture anymore. To live out, like the woman's role, was to live out God's purposes for his world. And what were those purposes? To be fruitful and multiply. And if you can't do that, what kind of curse do you have on you? That'd be the way they'd look at it. You have Peninnah, this one woman, who is fertile. So she's viewed as blessed. But she takes it all on herself. Look at me. Okay? You have somebody like Saul. Saul, who's going to think that he's mighty in his own eyes. You have a guy like Nabal. You might not know that character as much. We'll deal with him later. You do know this one, Goliath. Goliath is a character that's propped up as the strength of the Philistine army. You have a guy named Absalom, one of David's sons that we'll talk about later. All of these men are proud of their capacities. They are the mighty. But the mighty have their bows broken. But then there's these other group of people that the author highlights, and they are weak in the eyes of the Lord. Weak in the eyes of the world, and certainly in the Lord too. They are barren women. Hannah is going to be one of them. She can't have children. Barren. First chapter starts with two women, Peninnah and Hannah. You have the difference between the mighty and the weak. And who comes out? Hannah being the mother of Samuel. You have Hannah, barren woman. These people have no prospects, no strength whatsoever, but they are displayed in the book as being humble. And God exalts them. Why? Because God breaks the bow of the mighty. But those who are feeble, the weak, they're bound by strength, just not their own strength. This is what we're going to see. We're going to have characters like Hannah, Samuel, David. We think about David as a mighty man, but it didn't start there. David, that's another one. We ultimately know that the high point of the book, at least for me, is going to be the Davidic covenant. Davidic covenant shows you that this lowly shepherd boy, by the way, so not thought of that even when the prophet Samuel comes, his dad leaves him out into the field. I mean, he's forgotten by his own family. That guy is the one who's given an eternal covenant, an eternal kingdom through his line. The feeble are bound by strength in the book of Samuel. And those who are mighty in their own eyes, they're broken. They're destroyed. These are big picture realities that I want you to see as we walk through the individual narratives that we're going to work through, okay? There's all of these huge things, and listen, it's okay if you don't remember any of this for now. We're going to probably go this to where you're going to be like, I don't want to hear that anymore. Okay? We're going to be like, yeah, I get it. We can repeat it. But the point is, repetition, I think, is crucial to understand the themes of this book if we're going to understand properly where it fits in the history, where it fits in the overall story, and then how we apply it today in the new covenant. Different time period that we live in, but it's still needed for us today. All right. Let's think about just a couple of takeaways for the book as a whole. And this is where I think we can even do some application even today for your life right now. Think about this. Number one, don't mistake silence for absence. How often have I done this in my life? Oh my goodness. One of the first stories in the book would be Hannah, who's destitute because she can't have children. She is cursed, she feels, but it's also a public curse. People know that she can't have kids. And one of the opening scenes is her crying in the temple, in the tabernacle. Don't mistake silence for absence, right? Things were chaotic in Samuel's day in the nation of Israel, just like they are today in our culture. And the temptation is to say, listen, God's not doing anything. I guess God doesn't even care about such things, or he's inadequate. He can't do anything about it. It's not true. God's always working. Whether or not it's obscure to you is actually not relevant. God is always working. We have examples of this. Can you learn from other people? We have examples of God working in what they understood as obscurity, but he was active. He was active. His timing is not your timing. It's not my timing. He does what he wants, when he wants, with whomever he wants. And when he moves, he moves. And I think what the book of Samuel is trying to show us is, don't mistake the fact that you can't see something or understand something as God's abandoned you. It's not true. He never abandons his people. It's not true. He's preparing you for his purposes. That's a guarantee. Number 2, you live in humility. This is hard for us. Listen, this is hard for us. You live in humility. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He exalts the humble. Why? Because he breaks the bow of the mighty. That's what he does. You want to think you're something? He will humble you. He will not share glory. He will humble you. God breaks the bows of the mighty, but the feeble, those that are humble, those that recognize their radical need, those are who he exalts. That's the message across the board in the book of Samuel. And then ultimately, the whole goal is that we would look to the true king. All of these things that happen in the book of Samuel, that are happening even in your own lives, they're all pointing to something beyond us, all of it. They're going to highlight. The crazy thing about the book of Samuel to me is that it's going to present these larger than life characters. Saul, David, Solomon. Why didn't they get named in the book? Why isn't it called the book of David or something? He's the main character. Like Samuel is like this almost passing character. All of these are pictures. All of these are pointing to something beyond us. Even David as this kind of iconic, and then even this king that's like the type of king that we need. In other words, Judges shows us that the people need a king. Samuel tells us the kind of king that we need. Not Saul. That's the king after our hearts. We need a king like David. But even David, in the height of his righteousness, in the height of his power, was a poor shadow of the king that we're pointing to. And that's the point of the book. It's supposed to point us to the true king. We don't mistake silence for absence. God is never not working, never not working. Even if you feel like he has forgotten about you, he is only and always working in your life. If he allows you to see a glimpse of it, that's on him. But he's always working. In the midst of all that, you live humbly. You live in humility. You don't think more of yourself than you ought. You don't deserve anything. How do I hear people talk about, God owes me? Now, we might not use that language, but we certainly live that way. God owes me this. God owes me an explanation for this. How could he do this? How dare him? Do you realize who you are in the storyline? You're the one that committed the mutiny that he's letting live. Like, why should God let you wake up tomorrow? Does he owe that to you? He doesn't owe that to you. Live in humility. That's the key. And then look to the true king. That's the point. 1 Samuel sets us up for David, sure, but ultimately points us to Jesus, because that's the real king that we need. All right? Now, I wanted to do that again, just that brief intro to the whole storyline, and then to Samuel proper. What I just said is basically in this page, right? So if you wanted to read or look over this again, I'll probably even have a few more detail points in there. Do that, because I'm hoping as we walk through this book that we would be reminded of the thesis, that we would be reminded of all of these points that we are looking to, as we then walk through kind of these individual narratives. It's really, really important, okay? In the meantime, I think even as today, I would encourage you, go out of here trying to grasp the story that your life is a part of, because it's a part of God's story. He's only telling one story, right? I don't like it when people separate out Bible times versus modern times. That's not true. God's telling one story. This is all his storyline. And here we are. What is your role? Well, there's still some real reality from 1 Samuel, which is to live humbly. God will exalt the humble, but he turns his face away from the proud. So where are you at? This is a good question for us. Where are we at? Do I care about the things of God, and do I care that God would receive glory? Or is everything about me? Am I trying to make myself the main character in that storyline? You're not the main character. Right? Christ alone is the main character in God's storyline. He's the only one that undoes the Garden of Eden. That's where we're headed.